She wasn't looking for love. She wasn't even looking for help. She was just trying to get through one more Saturday without falling apart. But on that particular Saturday, inside a crowded shopping mall in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, one split-second decision, made out of nothing but fear, would change the rest of her life in ways she could never have imagined. And what makes this story so hard to let go of is this: it wasn't a movie. It wasn't scripted. It was real. The fear was real. The danger was real. And the man she reached for, completely at random, in the middle of a department store, he was more real, and more complicated, than anything she could have prepared herself for. She had 5 seconds to make a choice. And the choice she made, pulled two very different worlds into a collision that nobody saw coming. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. One desperate moment in a crowded mall. A woman running out of options. A powerful stranger who didn't flinch. And a secret that would unravel everything. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the man she chose at random was a billionaire hiding from the world himself. So ask yourself this. How many times have you walked through a crowded place, maybe a mall, maybe an airport, a grocery store, and made eye contact with a stranger and felt something you couldn't explain? A weird sense that this person was placed in your path for a reason. Most of us shake it off. Most of us keep walking. But what if the moment you looked away was the moment that could have changed everything? Elena Carter didn't look away. She didn't have time to. She grabbed that man's hand and held on for dear life, because behind her, the past she had spent 2 years trying to escape had just walked through the front door of Westfield Commons Mall wearing the same gray jacket he always wore when he was angry. Was this encounter coincidence or something else entirely? Who was this calm, well-dressed stranger who didn't flinch, didn't panic, and didn't ask a single question before saying those 2 quiet words, "Walk with me"? Why did Elena's ex, a man named Marcus Webb, suddenly vanish months after that day, with almost no public explanation? And why did investigators, when they finally pieced together the surveillance footage, find something that made even seasoned detectives go quiet? These are the questions that anchored this story. And they are questions that, by the end, you will not be able to stop thinking about. Noah worked in commercial real estate for 2 decades, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who was used to closing deals. He was funny in the way that men like Marcus are always funny, just clever enough to make you feel like you were in on the joke. At least not at first. He and Elena met at a charity auction for the Columbus Children's Hospital. He remembered the name of the movie she mentioned liking. He texted her the next morning with a specific and personal reference to something she had said the night before. Elena, who had been alone for 4 years and had quietly stopped expecting to feel chosen by anyone, felt something unlock in her chest. For the first 8 months, Marcus was everything. Attentive. Present. Thoughtful in ways that seemed almost architectural, as though he had studied what made Elena feel safe and then built a structure around it. He brought groceries when she worked late. He met Carol, was polite and easy. And Elena, steady and careful and practical Elena, let herself fall. But the cracks appeared gradually, the way they always do in relationships like this. Marcus began commenting on her friendships, quietly, persistently, planting seeds of doubt. "That Patrice always seemed a little jealous of you to me. I'm not saying Carol means anything by it. I just think she doesn't want you to be happy." Small observations delivered gently. But they were not observations. They were excavations. By the second year, he would show up at her workplace unannounced, call 4 times in an evening if she didn't respond to a text within 20 minutes, and when confronted, he sat on her kitchen floor and cried, and told her she was the only real thing in his life. And Elena, who was empathetic to a fault, believed him. By the time she ended the relationship, sitting at her kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday in November, reading back through 2 years of text messages, the certainty in her chest was absolute. She was gone before he had a key in the lock the next morning. She filed a harassment report with the Columbus Police Department. She changed her locks. She told herself she was safe. 3 weeks before that Saturday at the mall, Marcus sent a message to an old email address he knew she had forgotten about. She never showed it to anyone at the time. But later, when investigators asked her to recall it, she repeated every word. "I've been watching you put your life back together. It looks good from where I'm standing. Don't get too comfortable, Elena. If I can't have you, nobody will." She read that message and she closed her laptop and she sat very still in her kitchen for a long time. And the tomato plants on the balcony rustled in the evening wind, and Biscuit jumped up onto the table, and Elena put her hand on the cat's back and tried to remember how to breathe. It was a Saturday in late January. One of those cold, flat-sky Ohio Saturdays where the light looks like it gave up halfway through the morning and everything outside smells faintly of rock salt and exhaust. Elena had gone to Westfield Commons Mall for 2 reasons: she needed new work shoes, and she needed to feel normal. After weeks of looking over her shoulder, of double-checking her locks, of flinching at cars that slowed near her building, she had made a deliberate decision to do something ordinary. She told herself she was not going to live like a hostage in her own life. She put on her good coat, the burgundy one, and she drove to the mall and found a parking spot near the east entrance and walked inside into the warmth and the noise and the Saturday crowd and felt, for the first time in weeks, something that resembled calm. She found the shoes she needed in the third store she tried. She bought a coffee from the kiosk near the fountain and stood for a moment watching the crowd move around her, families with strollers, teenagers in clusters, older couples moving slowly and contentedly, and she thought, "This is fine. This is good. You are fine." She was heading back toward the east entrance, coffee in one hand, shopping bag in the other, when she saw him. He was standing near the entrance to a sporting goods store, maybe 40 feet away, and he was wearing the gray jacket. The one he wore when he was angry. And he was not shopping. He was watching her. Their eyes met for less than a second before Elena turned away, her heart slamming so hard against her ribs she could feel it in her throat. She did not run. Running would confirm she had seen him. Running would make it real. Instead, she kept walking, her pace casual and her mind working at a speed that had nothing to do with casual. She had left her phone in the car. She had left her phone in the car. She scanned the crowd in front of her with the focus of someone who has just been told the building is on fire but must not say so out loud. She needed to be near people. She needed witnesses. She needed someone, anyone, who looked solid and calm and unlikely to be rattled. And that is when she saw him. He was standing near a display outside a home goods store, slightly apart from the crowd, looking at something on his phone with the relaxed stillness of a man who was in no particular hurry. He was well dressed but not flashily so, dark slacks, a good overcoat, silver at his temples. He looked, Elena would say later, like a man who had seen a great deal of the world and been surprised very little by it. She did not think about what she was doing. There was no time for thought. She crossed the 8 feet between them in 3 seconds, and she reached out and she took his hand. She took a stranger's hand in a crowded mall and held on as though the floor had just dropped out from under her. He looked up from his phone. He looked at her hand holding his. Then he looked at her face. And something passed across his expression, not alarm, not irritation, but something quieter and more unsettling than either of those things. Recognition. Not of Elena specifically, but of the look on her face. He had seen that look before. "Please," she said, barely above a whisper. "Please. Pretend you know me. There's a man behind me and I think he's going to, please. Just for a minute." There was a pause. Not long. Maybe 2 full seconds. Then the man closed his phone, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and turned so that he was standing beside her, shoulder to shoulder, facing the same direction. "Walk with me," he said. That was all he said. And they walked. Think about what Elena must have felt in those seconds. The terror that had been compressing in her chest for weeks, the exhaustion of constant vigilance, the loneliness of carrying a threat that no one else could see, and then suddenly, without warning, the simple physical fact of someone standing beside her. Someone who did not question her, did not hesitate, did not ask her to explain herself before deciding whether she deserved to be believed. He just said, "Walk with me." If you have ever been in a moment where you needed someone to simply take you at your word and not let you stand alone, you understand exactly what those 3 words meant to Elena Carter on that Saturday morning. If you're still watching at this point, drop the words, "I'm still here," in the comments below. I want to know who among you would have done exactly what Elena did. His name was Daniel Hayes. He was 58 years old. He had grown up in Cincinnati, the son of a machinist and a school librarian, and he had built, over 3 decades of focused and relentless work, a privately held commercial real estate and investment company called Hayes Capital Group, with assets under management in excess of $4 billion. He was not a household name. He did not appear on Forbes lists voluntarily. He had spent the better part of his adult life operating with a near-total deliberate invisibility, no social media presence of any kind, a small circle of trusted associates, a penthouse in Columbus and a farmhouse in rural Virginia. What he did have was a significant, long-standing ownership interest in Westfield Commons Mall, among several other Columbus area properties, and a private security team stationed at 3 different points within that building on that Saturday morning. What Elena did not know was that the moment Marcus Webb entered that mall, a member of Daniel's security team had already flagged him. Not because of Elena. Not because of any foreknowledge of her situation. But because Marcus Webb had a documented history, a prior restraining order in another county, a civil judgment, a pattern that appeared in public records, and a competent security detail running routine checks on the building's foot traffic that morning had surfaced it within minutes of his arrival. Marcus Webb had not entered that building anonymously. He had entered it already being watched. And when Elena reached for Daniel Hayes's hand, she was, without knowing it, stepping into a circle of protection that had already quietly formed. Within 20 minutes of Elena and Daniel stepping through the staff door, 2 members of his security team had positioned themselves near Marcus. A retired Columbus police sergeant named Pete Garza, who worked the Saturday morning shift, approached Marcus near a pretzel kiosk in the center atrium. Pete had the restraining order information already on his tablet. He told Marcus that his presence had been noted and that given the existing legal documentation, it would be in his best interest to exit the property voluntarily. Marcus looked toward the south end of the building. Then he walked to the east exit and left. A Columbus police officer was waiting in the parking lot. Marcus was spoken to. His information was documented. He was not arrested that day. That decision would become very significant later. Elena sat in a small break room in the staff area of the mall for 45 minutes before she felt steady enough to call Carol. She drank a cup of tea that someone had made for her without being asked. Daniel sat across from her for a while, not talking much, not asking her to explain herself or recount events. When Elena finally stood up to leave, she looked at this man she had grabbed by the hand 90 minutes earlier and said the only thing she could think to say. "Why did you help me?" she asked. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because somebody should have helped someone I loved. And nobody did." In the days that followed that Saturday, Elena tried to return to her routines. But routines are hard to maintain when the thing you feared has shown its face in a public place in broad daylight and proven, conclusively, that it has not stopped watching. For days after the mall incident, she woke to find both front tires on her car slashed. The Columbus Police Department documented it. Detective Rhonda Sims, the same officer who had taken Elena's original harassment report months earlier, was now treating the pattern as an escalating stalking case and had begun building a formal file. 3 days after the tires, Elena received an email from an anonymous address. There was no message in the body. There was only an image, a photograph of her front door, taken from very close range, time-stamped the previous evening. She forwarded it to Detective Sims within 20 minutes of opening it. Then she picked up the phone and dialed the number that Daniel Hayes had quietly left on the table in that staff break room before he left. She had not planned to use it. She did not entirely understand why she used it now. But she dialed it, and it rang twice, and then he answered. The local Columbus media became aware of the mall incident approximately 1 week later, through a source in the Westfield Common Security Department whose identity was never established. The reporting was initially brief. A local CBS affiliate ran a short segment titled "Unknown Businessman Intervenes in Domestic Incident at Columbus Mall." They did not name Daniel Hayes. The segment ran for 3 days before a regional wire service picked it up and the story began to circulate more widely. Within 2 weeks, a Washington Post reporter had identified Daniel Hayes and attempted to reach his office for comment. His communications team issued a single statement: Mr. Hayes was present at a property he holds an interest in and responded in a manner consistent with the safety protocols of that property. He has nothing further to add. It was, in its careful brevity, a masterclass in saying nothing. But behind that careful nothing, things were moving fast. Detective Sims had now connected Marcus Webb to a prior harassment case in Franklin County involving a different woman, a case that had been settled civilly and sealed at the plaintiff's request. A second woman named Deborah, a former colleague of Marcus's, had seen the local news coverage and contacted the police department of her own accord. She had her own documentation. Her own emails. Her own photographs of a slashed tire from 3 years earlier. And her own story of a relationship that had escalated in exactly the pattern Elena described, a story she had spent years carrying in silence because she had been afraid and ashamed and had believed for a long time that no one would take her seriously. Hearing Elena's story had broken something open in Deborah. Because sometimes it only takes knowing that someone else saw what you saw, and was not imagined, to change everything. Investigators began building a timeline that stretched back years. What they were assembling was not just a stalking case. It was a portrait of a man who had operated the same way, in the same sequence of behaviors, across multiple relationships. The charm. The isolation. The escalating surveillance. The threats calibrated just precisely enough to terrify but not quite precise enough to guarantee arrest. Marcus Webb was not impulsive. He was methodical. And that methodical quality, investigators would later note, made the evidence against him unusually coherent. Every woman he had frightened had kept records, even when she doubted herself. Even when she told herself she was overreacting. They had kept the emails and the screenshots and the photographs of the damage because some part of them had always known, on a level below conscious reasoning, that one day they might need them. Then, 4 months after the mall incident, Marcus Webb was simply gone. He did not show up to a scheduled meeting with his real estate firm. He did not respond to calls from his attorney. His apartment in Dublin, Ohio was checked by a building manager who had been called by neighbors noting unusual quiet. Everything in the apartment was in order. His car was not there. He was not there. The Columbus Police Department issued a bulletin. Detective Sims flagged his travel history and known credit accounts. For 6 weeks, Marcus Webb was the subject of an active search that the public knew very little about, because the investigation was being kept deliberately quiet to avoid tipping him off if he was monitoring news coverage, which, given his documented behavior, investigators assumed he likely was. The trail went cold in Louisiana before it went warm again. When investigators finally located Marcus Webb, 6 weeks after his disappearance from Columbus, he was in a motel outside Shreveport, using a prepaid card and a name that was not his own. But what he was running from was not just the investigation in Ohio. What he was running from was something else entirely, something that, when it surfaced, reframed the entire story in ways that even Detective Sims had not fully anticipated. And that revelation was about to change everything. Marcus Webb had significant and deeply tangled financial problems that predated his relationship with Elena by several years. He had been operating, essentially, as a man with 2 lives, the polished commercial real estate professional on the surface, and underneath, a man with mounting debts, a pattern of failed investments, and at least one situation that federal investigators would later describe, carefully, as potentially fraudulent representation of assets to lenders. Several of the people Marcus had harmed financially were not strangers. Two of them were former romantic partners whose relationships with him had followed the same trajectory as Elena's: charming arrival, gradual isolation, escalating control, and who had, without realizing they shared a pattern, each lost significant amounts of money to investments Marcus had recommended and then mismanaged. He was not just a stalker. He was a predator in a broader and more calculated sense, and the fear he used to control the women in his life served a financial purpose as well as an emotional one. Isolated women do not compare notes. Isolated women do not talk to each other. That was what Marcus had always been counting on. He was arrested in that Shreveport motel on a Tuesday afternoon in August. The officers noted in their report that he was cooperative, quiet, and that he asked almost immediately whether his lawyer was aware of the situation. He was extradited to Ohio, where the charges included aggravated stalking, felony telecommunications harassment, and 3 counts related to financial fraud. The evidence was extensive. The surveillance footage from Westfield Commons. The emails. The photograph of Elena's door. Deborah's testimony. A third woman who came forward after the arrest was made public, with documentation going back 7 years. And the testimony of Elena Carter herself. Elena Carter sat in a courtroom in Franklin County, Ohio on a morning in the following March and spoke for 41 minutes without looking away from the jury once. She did not dramatize what Marcus had done to her. She did not raise her voice. She described, in careful and specific detail, what it feels like to have someone systematically dismantle your trust in your own perception of reality. She described the particular loneliness of being afraid of someone that everyone else seemed to find charming. She described the email with the photograph of her door, and the way she had sat very still after reading it with her hand resting on the back of her cat and tried to remember how to breathe. And then she paused, and she said something that made the courtroom go completely still. "The thing I want you to understand," Elena said, "is that I thought, for a long time, that I should have seen it coming. That I was foolish. That I let it happen. I want you to know that I know now that I was wrong about that. He was very good at what he did. And I was not weak for not seeing it. I was just human." The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Marcus Webb was found guilty on all counts. And if you have never watched someone you care about sit in a room full of strangers and speak the complete truth about the worst thing that happened to them, and be believed, you cannot fully understand what that moment looked like on Elena Carter's face when the verdict was read. But the people in that courtroom who watched it said they would never forget it. Now here is the part of this story that changes everything you thought you understood about Daniel Hayes. Here is the piece that an investigative reporter, after months of careful research following the trial, eventually uncovered and wrote about in a long-form piece that circulated widely and quietly for weeks before the mainstream media caught up with it. Daniel Hayes had been quietly, anonymously funding a network of domestic violence shelters and legal aid organizations across Ohio for over 15 years. He had never attached his name to any of it. He had structured the funding through a private foundation with a name that gave nothing away on its surface, the Christine Trust. Named for his younger sister, Christine Hayes, who died in a hospital on a Thursday morning in March of 1998, from injuries her husband told the emergency room she sustained in a fall. She was 30 years old. Her husband, Raymond Pryor, was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 22 years. He was released on parole after 14. Daniel Hayes attended every single parole hearing. He was there every time. Daniel had been 32 when Christine died. He had been building his company. He had been busy. He had noticed the look on Christine's face in the months before she died, the careful, watchful quality of a woman managing someone else's volatility, and he had filed it away and told himself there would be time. There was not time. And for 26 years, Daniel Hayes had lived with the specific and unrelenting grief of a door he had not opened in time. He had not spoken publicly about Christine. He had not sought acknowledgement for anything the Christine Trust had funded. Only his attorney and one trusted colleague knew the connection behind the name. He had simply, for 15 years, put money quietly into the places where women like his sister, women like Elena, might find a door that was open when they needed it. And on a Saturday morning in January, in a crowded Columbus mall, he had finally gotten to stand in that doorway himself. When Elena reached for his hand, she was, without knowing it, reaching for a man who had spent 26 years waiting for that moment. Not for her specifically, but for the chance to be the person who did not walk away. In the year following the trial, Elena Carter resigned from her retail floor manager position, the job she had held for 11 years, the job that had given her structure and routine through the hardest period of her life, and she went to work as a program coordinator at a domestic violence support center in Columbus called Harbor House. It was not a decision made from drama or grand gesture. It was a decision made from the specific clarity of a woman who had been through something that showed her exactly what mattered and exactly what she wanted to spend her remaining working years doing. She told Carol about it on a Sunday phone call, and Carol was quiet for a moment and then said, "That is the most you thing you have ever done," and they both laughed, and Elena stood on her balcony in the spring air with the phone against her ear and the tomato seedlings coming in along the railing, and she felt something she had almost forgotten, settled. She and Daniel Hayes did not have a dramatic beginning. That is important to say, and it is important to resist the temptation of this story to become something it was not. He did not pursue her. She did not pursue him. What they had in its early form was something more modest and more durable than pursuit, correspondence. He called once to check on her in the weeks after the trial, and the call lasted nearly an hour, and neither of them quite understood why. He sent her a book, a memoir by a woman who had rebuilt her life after a traumatic relationship, with a short handwritten note that said only, "Thought you might find this useful." Or not. Either way. She called to tell him whether she had found it useful or not, and that call lasted 2 hours. Something was growing between them, something careful and slow and built on the specific foundation of two people who had both learned, through very different losses, that the things worth having are not the things you grab at in a moment of excitement, but the things you build gradually and honestly over time. 2 years after that Saturday in Westfield Commons Mall, Daniel Hayes and Elena Carter were married in a small ceremony at his farmhouse in rural Virginia. 14 guests. Carol as Elena's maid of honor. No media. No press release. No announcement of any kind until a mutual friend mentioned it casually in an unrelated interview 3 months later. The photograph that circulated, taken by Carol on her phone, showed Elena in a simple cream dress standing in a field of tall grass with the late afternoon light coming in low and gold, laughing at something Daniel had just said. She looked, as Carol later described it, like herself. Like herself in a way she hadn't looked in years. This story was inspired by a real incident reported in early 2026, when a woman in Butler, Pennsylvania escaped her ex-boyfriend, who had assaulted and forced her into a vehicle, by running barefoot across a snowy parking lot into a convenience store, where staff protected her until police arrived and he was charged with kidnapping and aggravated assault. The names and details in this story are fictionalized. But the terror that woman felt, running across a frozen parking lot with no shoes, not knowing what came next, that was real. And stories like hers happen every single day, mostly to people who carry them in silence for far too long. Think about what Elena must have carried between the woman who read those threatening messages at her kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night and the woman in that Virginia field in a cream dress, laughing. Think about every moment of fear and doubt and exhausted vigilance that existed between those two versions of the same person. And then think about 5 seconds in a shopping mall. One decision made in terror. A hand she reached for. And everything that followed. She thought she was grabbing a stranger to save herself from immediate danger. And she was. But she was also, without knowing it, reaching toward a story that would crack open a predator's double life, connect 3 women who had never known they shared a history, and find its way to a trust built 15 years earlier in the name of a woman who never got to see what it would do. She thought she grabbed a stranger. What she really found was safety. Now we want to ask you something before we close, and we want you to actually sit with this. If you had been in that mall on that Saturday morning, and a woman you had never met reached for your hand and said, "Please, pretend you know me, what would you have done? Would you have hesitated? Would you have asked too many questions? Or would you have done what Daniel Hayes did, tucked your phone away, turned to stand beside her, and said, "Walk with me"? Have you ever ignored a red flag because the feeling of connection was stronger than the warning? Have you ever been the person who saw something wrong and didn't know what to do? Have you ever had a moment where a stranger's small act of decency changed the direction of things for you? Drop your answer in the comments. We genuinely read them. And to those of you who are living right now in a version of what Elena was living, in the careful silence of a relationship that takes more from you than it gives, in the exhaustion of managing someone else's volatility, in the loneliness of a fear that nobody else seems to see, we want you to hear this part clearly. You are not imagining it. You are not weak. And there are doors that are open. The number for the National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. You can also text that number or visit thehotline.org. A real person will answer. Sometimes one decision changes everything, not because of luck, but because you finally chose yourself. You finally said, even without words, "I will not stand here alone in this." Elena Carter reached out her hand in a moment of pure desperation, and she grabbed hold of something that changed her life. She didn't know what she was reaching for. She only knew she could not stay where she was. And that impulse, "I cannot stay where I am," is where every act of survival begins. Subscribe to this channel and click the bell so you never miss a story like this one. And if you think this story was powerful, wait until you hear about the woman who vanished completely for 12 years and the place where she was finally found. That story will change the way you think about the people who go missing and the ones who choose to disappear. We will see you there.